Introduction to Game Theory. In this one, we're just simply going to introduce some basic definitions and concepts. It will be a short lecture followed by some problems that you have to solve. And then the rest of the concepts for this chapter, we are going to introduce them when I provide the answers to those problems. So this first initial lecture will be short. And I have 4 goals, basically. The first is to define what is a game of strategy. Then to talk about a little bit about the basic rules of a game. What are the basic 2 types of games that we will have? And finally, we'll talk a little bit about player strategies. And to answer all these questions, we're going to use the same example we started using last time, which is this prisoner dilemma example, which is a classic game in game theory. And remember, the situation is the following: the district attorney doesn't have enough evidence to convict these 2 criminals that are captured. So what she does is she put them in different rooms, and then they offer to each of them the following. They say, if you confess and your partner doesn't, then you get a reduced 1-year sentence on the basis of that confession, and your partner will get 10 years. Now, if both of you confess, then you each get 3 years. And also, we know that both of them know that if neither of them confesses, the lack of evidence will cause them to be tried for a lesser crime, for which they will receive a 2-year sentence. So is this a game of strategy? Right. Well, the first thing we need to know is what is the definition of a game of strategy. And we're going to use a very basic definition of a game in this class will be the following. It's a situation where there are 2 or more mutually aware players, and the outcome for each depends on the actions of all. Now, notice that in this definition, we're not saying that one person has to win and the other one person has to lose. That might be that's definitely going to be the case in some games, but it's not going to be the case in all games. We're going to define game even more basically than that by saying that it's just a situation where when the decisions of players affect the outcome of all the players. So this is clearly a game because you have 2 players and they're making one decision, and the decision of each of the players will affect both of them. So once we establish this is a game, then what are the basic rules of a game? Well, in essence, we have 4 basic rules of a game. The first one is the list of players. And on this one, we have 2, right? So we have two criminals. The second one has to do with the strategies. And the rules tell you what they can do. What they can do is to confess or not. The third part of the rules are the payoff. In this particular one are the years that you'll spend, that each person will spend in jail. They know that different decisions will lead to different years in jail for each of them. So we call those the payoff, which are the results of different outcomes of this particular game. And finally, the last thing that is implicit in the rules of a game is that both players are rational, meaning that both players will make decisions that are going to try to make themselves better off. Now, what are the basic 2 types of game we will see in this class? Well, again, let's just see that in the context of this game. What kind of game is this one? Well, we call this simultaneous game because, as it turns out, the rules of the game specify that both of these players are going to make decisions at the same time. Or, in other words, saying that they can decide without knowing what the other person have decided. All right. Now, I think to understand what a simultaneous game is to contrast it with the other kind of game. So suppose I added one more rule to this game, which is the following. I said, suppose that the next rule says that one prisoner will decide first, and then the other prisoner decides knowing the decision of the other prisoner. So in other words, the district attorney go to one room to prisoner A, John, and he said, make your decision. And then John makes a decision. And he goes to the other room to Sally and says, Sally, John made this decision. Now you have to decide, right? So in this particular situation, the game will be inherently different, in which it will be a sequential game. One player decides first, then the other player make a decision. Now, one thing that is interesting is that not necessarily we will tend to think that in a sequential game, the person who chooses first will have an advantage. But as you will see later in the semester, that's hardly going to be the case in many games. But games can be either simultaneous or they can be sequential. So we're going to do that broad definition, that broad separation in terms of the types of game. And we are also going to separate the content of the class in that, right? So we're going to begin our discussion of game theory in the next chapter with some simultaneous games, which is the game of the classic game of the prisoner dilemma. And then finally, the strategies, right? So the strategies can, in this particular prisoner dilemma, the strategy that each player could have, it has to do with how they choose in a way that maximizes the benefits they get from the payoff. And in this particular case, it's pretty straightforward because it's just one time. But in other games, strategies can get very complicated because they can basically represent a set of a sequence of actions or a group of actions that are going to happen one time after time. But now that you have those four things, there's a lot that you can do. So I want you to try some of the applications and questions in the rest of the quiz. And then I will provide an answer to those later in the week that would allow you to understand a lot of the concepts in this chapter too.